This is the collar for the man's shirt, that in order to make it obvious as we work with the collar and the undercollar, I'm actually using two different fabrics. The printed fabric will be my fashion fabric or the collar. The plain green is going to be my undercollar. The first step in making a collar is to attach the sew-in interfacing to the wrong side of the collar. The interfacing is sewn by stitching from center back, basting from center back to the tip of the collar, from center back to the edge, neckline edge of the collar, from the white end of the tip down toward the neckline edge. And so it will be sewn in 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6 on the other side. When that is in place, then we are ready to attach the collar to what will be the undercollar. Just like we had to with the cuffs, we're going to have to favor this edge. The collar is going to go around this person's neck, so it needs to be favored like the cuff was as it went around the sleeve, but it also is going to come out of a collar band and roll down towards the shirt. And so it has to be favored to go around a person and to come up and over. In order to favor it two directions, if you remember on your sleeve, we pulled that, on the cuff, we pulled the cuff in 1/8 of an inch from the cuff facing. We're going to do the same thing with the collar, but we are also going to pull it down 1/8 of an inch from the neckline edge or from your notched edge here. And so as you pin the collar to the collar facing, your first two pins will go at this corner where your neckline edge meets. And so I'm going to pull it in 1/8 of an inch along the bottom edge, and I'm going to pull it 1/8 of an inch along that front edge. Okay. When I get to the tip of the collar, it should align at the style edge. And so my third pin goes up here at my style edge, making sure that that meets my third and fourth pin by the time I get up here to 5/8 of an inch. And so I've got that little bit of ease that's got to come in. This eases pretty easily because this style edge of your collar is on a bias and it will stretch. And so it stretches very easily, allowing those two edges to be able to be made the same length. And so if you will just lay it down flat, pull it out, with one hand hold it in place, with the other hand pin into that so that you are taking that ease and distributing it along the tip of that collar. Okay? And then as you sew it, that will pin in place. Then match up center back. You have a clip at center back, match those clips up, and you will see that you have a little bit of ease from the side to center back as well, because we pulled it in that 1/8 of an inch. And you will just do the same thing. You will pull that and pin it in place, lining up that style edge. And so just give it a pull and a pin so that you get it pinned in place and that ease distributed. And then you'll have it pinned all the way across. Before you sew, one of the things that you can check, if you will just lay this down with the undercollar up, you will see that this collar tends to curl on both sides, and you want to make sure that it is tending to curl on both sides, that you didn't get all the ease to one side. If one side lays flat and one side curls up, you took that 1/8 of an inch and you pushed it all the way to one side. And so you want to be certain that as you lay it, just turn it over, lay it down, it tends to roll up on both edges. If it does, you are now ready to sew. And so we are going to go stitch this. We are going to start at center back, and we are going to stitch from center back towards the tip of the collar and then down towards the neckline edge, and then do the same thing on the other side going from center back. So I will start in the middle of my back here. There's the notch. I'm going to go just past the notch, drop my needle in position. Now, because I have eased this and pulled it, I need to apply some pressure front and back as I stitch, holding on to the collar and the collar facing holding onto that stretch and keeping that ease so that I don't wind up with a tuck as I'm sewing. And so from pin to pin, I will go back again, put that hand behind, applying a little bit of pressure as I sew. Heading towards the tip here. You've got to be careful that you don't let the ease sew off the edge of the tip, so be sure you hold on to that tight. As you approach the tip, because we're going to have to trim and grade very closely, you are going to change your stitch length and go down to a reinforcement stitch. And so I've gone down to reinforcement. I continue to sew towards the tip here. Now, instead of just literally picking the presser foot up and pivot turning and heading down the other side, there's going to be a lot of fabric that has to get into that narrow tip. You will actually get a nicer tip and a better look if you will turn it, go at 45 degrees, and you're going to take one stitch diagonally across the tip of that collar. Okay? If your fabric is bulky, you may need to take 2 stitches. As you're sewing down this last side here, and I'll do the 2 sides differently so you can see, remember my 5/8 of an inch is 5/8 of an inch from my collar, which is the top one. I pulled the collar band, or the collar facing, out 1/8 of an inch, and so that is why I'm now lined up here, back there at 6/8, or the one line past 5/8, as I'm coming back. And so you can, as you're heading down, line up that direction, and I've gone 1/2 inch. I'm going to go ahead and go back to regulation stitch, holding in front and behind as I sew, keeping that little bit of pressure on. Come towards the edge and back stitch at that edge. Okay. The other thing that you can do, pull this down, yeah, okay. If you don't like sewing along the 6/8, after you've pulled that edge out, you can just simply go back now and trim the undercollar or the collar facing so that it matches up or is the same length as the upper collar or your fashion fabric, the piece that was interfaced. And by trimming that, now I can simply line up and sew at 5/8 on both sides. And so either one of those techniques are correct. You can do whichever one works best for you. As you go down the other side, you have 2 choices. You can reverse and sew along the stitch plate or along the guideline on the outside of your stitch plate, which will allow you still to sew with the collar side up. If that bothers you, your other option is to turn it over and you'll sew still along your first 5/8 line, and it allows you to sew on the side of the stitch plate that you are probably more used to sewing, but now you are sewing collar facing up as opposed to collar up. Okay? Either one again works. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm going to go ahead and sew on the outside edge. Line that up. You'll notice that I'm going to go back over the top of my stitching just a little bit. Now, I am using a contrasting thread. I'm doing that on purpose so that you can see the thread easily on the interfacing and see the thread easily on the fabric. You will probably choose one that matches a little bit better. If I sew back over the top of my stitches, I can just take a couple and take one little back stitch. Now my first threads from sewing the opposite side there are secured by the fact that I just sewed over the top of them. And I didn't have to have 2 rows of back stitching sitting right on top of each other or right next to each other, which would make a fairly bulky section on the back of my collar. Doing the same thing, just applying some pressure, pulling on that collar as I sew, so that that ease comes in. Again, as I approach the tip of this collar, I'm going to go back down to reinforcement stitching. And remember, I trimmed this side, so when I turn, and I've got this, I want to be able to line up at 5/8, so I'm about where I want to be then. I'm going to take again that one stitch diagonally, and when I turn it, I'm exactly lined up on 5/8 of an inch. Give this fabric a pull. Go about a half an inch with reinforcement stitching, head back to regulation. The reason we do the reinforcement stitching at the tip of that collar is that it's going to get trimmed and graded very, very closely. And we've got to be able to reduce the seam allowance and not have it wind up fraying out. So we stitch down, back stitch. All right, bring your collar back, lay it down. It should again curl up on both edges, along the neckline edge and out here on the style edge. It should curl up on both edges. If it does, you are now ready to trim and grade. And you are going to trim and grade so that your collar is 3/8 of an inch, your inner facing is 1/8 of an inch, and your collar facing is 1/4. If you were careful in basting on that inner facing at 1/4 of an inch, you truly can just use your basting line as the line to trim along as you trim along that collar. And so you can trim that. That separates the collar from the inner facing. So my collar is now trimmed to 3/8 of an inch. I can now go back and trim my inner facing to the 1/8 of an inch, or as close as I can get it, all the way around, and then trim my collar facing to 1/4 of an inch. So you will see the collar facing at the 1/4 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch less than the collar itself. The collar at 3/8 of an inch, the inner facing at 1/8. And you will trim and grade your outside style edge of the collar. Okay? You will not trim and grade the neckline edge or the notched edge. It is still open. You've got to leave that one alone still. So I will finish trimming and grading, and then we'll get back together. All right, when you're trimmed and graded, now we have to address the collar tip. This tip area, all of this fabric has to fit down inside that tip, so we've got to do something about the extra fabric at the tip of that. So we are going to actually cut across diagonally and then swoop cut back towards that tip. Be very careful not to cut too close. You've got to get close, but not too close. So again, we're going to cut across it diagonally and then swoop cut back so that there's a chance now that that fabric, when it's folded up, can lay inside the area that it's designed for. After we're trimmed and graded, we need to press. We're going to press it on a point presser. I will quite often actually press first and then trim and grade and then press again, because if you've trimmed really close, that it can become somewhat difficult to get the seam open without putting your fingers really close to the tip of the iron, and you risk burning yourself. And so I will quite often press it open, then trim and grade, and then press it again. We're going to press it on the top of this point presser here. Press the tip of the collar, and then we're going to press the back collar seam. Before you put it on this point presser, you'll press it flat as you sewed it, and then you press it open on the point presser. That will help to define that edge for you and embed those stitches in the seam. The other thing that the point presser does that's kind of nice, because it's a hard surface, it helps to give a really crisp edge to what you're stitching there. And so the seam is pressed open. Look inside, make sure the edge is well defined, that the edge looks crisp there. Okay. And then when all is said and done, and it's turned right side out, we don't want that undercolor, and this is where I've made a different color, we don't want the undercolor showing along the edge. It's very obvious here that it shows. We would like it to be slightly favored and underneath. In order for that to occur, after you've pressed this on the point presser, if you will now up inside your color, you're going to take and press the seam now along that outside style edge, and you can't get clear to the tip, but just reach up there as far as you can and press that style edge, the seam towards the undercolor. And by pressing that seam towards the undercolor, it helps to define that style edge and it will help to favor it. Don't go clear to the tip, not only because the iron won't get in there, but we just spent quite a bit of time trying to get that tip to curl. And if you press it flat on a flat surface, you're going to take that curl out that we just spent time getting in. Okay. We want to try to get that tip out as close as we possibly can. One way that works really well, if you will just take a needle and thread, you are going to, remember that little stitch that went across, that little 1 millimeter stitch? I'm going to come up from inside my collar here and bring that needle and thread between the seam allowance. I'm coming out between the seam allowance on one side of that 1 millimeter stitch, and then I'm going to turn around and go back on the other side of that 1 millimeter stitch. And so I've come out, I leave my thread tail there, do not pull it all the way through, and then I turn around and come back in right in that 1 millimeter stitch and get the needle going back in between the middle of the collar there. And this is going to create for me a little thread handle that I can pull on. Come on out, you. So I pull that collar right side out. I've got the little threads, and if I just very gently pull on that thread handle, it will help me to pull that collar or that corner out. Another technique that you can use is take your pin, and you can use your pin to very gently along the seam allowance pull the seam out. You have to be very careful as you do this that you're actually catching the stitches, not grabbing your fabric, but actually getting in there between it, getting a hold of the stitch and pulling that stitch out so that you get your fabric pulled out to as close as a tip as you can get it. When you get pretty close, if you will just take your fingers and fold that collar seam to seam. And all I'm doing is rotating my fingers, rubbing my fingers back and forth. So I'm kind of spinning the collar back and forth there. And what that does is helps to untangle, if you will, the seam allowance that is up inside of there. And it will help you to get a sharp tip. And so you can see that I've created now a sharp tip to that collar. And I will now do the same thing with the other guy, get a thread tail through and pull it through. So the second tip is out. On this one I actually left the thread tail in because I want to show you something that you can do with that thread tail after when you're ready to work with it there. So we're now going to press this collar. The neckline edge, or the long neckline edge here, we can press on a flat surface. And if you will press it collar facing side up, you can actually see that little favored edge. And so you want to see just the very slightest bit of color showing. You want the seam to be just barely to that bottom edge. Common mistake that people will make is, well, I want to make sure it doesn't show, and so they will pull it clear over, which pulls the collar out of position. Basically, if you remember, we press that seam allowance towards the collar facing, or the under collar. And so if you just turn and press this, it just about auto favors, and you get just that little teeny tiny rim. You can see that little tiny rim of orange that's showing there on the bottom. Okay. Again, we do not want to press the tip though. Notice that tip is still curling up. So we are going to take this tip and now press it over a ham because we want it to continue to curl down. So look very carefully and just get it over the hem. Barely make sure. If you'll just use your finger and just roll it again, roll the fabric between your fingers so that your undercolor is barely rolled under. And now I'm going to press that on a ham. Which is helping to maintain that curl that we worked so hard to get in the first place. And so the tip of your collar gets pressed, fashion fabric out. Again, it would be best if you to have a press cloth there. It would be difficult for you to see what I'm doing with the press cloth covering up what I'm sewing though, so I am not going to use a press cloth. And this is actually just a sample anyhow. It's not going to go on a shirt, it's just going to be a collar that gets made. Okay? And you need to do both tips. Do the same thing on both tips. Be sure you get that pulled out so that the collar facing just barely is rolled under. And press that tip. Now we're going to do another check here. And ideally, again, these tips should curl up. The collar should not want to lay flat. It should want to roll up, which it does. Okay? It wants to roll up, remember, because we pulled the collar facing out, or the under collar out, so that my green piece of fabric here is actually shorter than my orange piece of fabric, so it's tending to pull those edges up, which is exactly what we want to have happen. Okay? Take your collar, line it up, make sure that your collar tips are the same length. It will look really funny when you make your shirt if one collar is long and one collar is short, because they're going to come out of your neck at center front and be close to each other. And so you want to make sure that as you sewed that they are the same length and that your tips are the same size and they look about the same. So when you're pleased with them and both tips are the same, okay, then we are ready to either edge stitch or top stitch the style edge. You will do whatever type of stitching it was you did on your button band and on the style edge of your cuffs. So if you have been edge stitching You will edge stitch this edge. If you've been top stitching, you will top stitch it. And we are going to start at the neckline edge and go all the way around to the other neckline edge. We're not going to start at the center back and go with the grain anymore. It's been stabilized, it's got interfacing in it, it's been stitched, it shouldn't slip or slide on us, and so we're just going to stitch around that. All right, so line up the collar for either edge stitching or top stitching. Remember, edge stitching will be 1/8 of an inch or less away. Top stitching will be 1/4 of an inch or more with whatever it was you were doing. And you're going to stitch around that outside edge. Now remember, when we first sewed this, we took 1 stitch across the corner. When you're edge stitching and top stitching, you will not. You will just turn that corner. And I left the little pull thread in on one side so you can see the difference. As I'm turning this corner, I'm having to hand wheel and push a little bit because there is such a teeny tiny little bit of fabric on the feed dog. It doesn't tend to want to pull very well. So you saw I had to work with that a little bit to get it to go. As we head to the other side here, and again, kind of hold on to this, give it a little bit of pull and pressure because we do still have collar and collar facing, collar and under collar, that are 2 different lengths, one being pulled out a little bit shorter than the other, so give it a little bit of pressure as you pull, as you sew. Okay. Now, if you use the thread tails and you kept them in, when you come towards that collar, and you get right to the tip, and you turn that corner, I've now got a handle that I can hold or pull on. And notice how much easier this corner was to sew by just pulling that handle and getting that stitching to be held in place. All right, so the collar has been edge stitched. Once that's done, now go ahead and just pull the thread tail out. You don't need that anymore, but it served a purpose that was quite helpful with that. All right, back to the board. So we've got the collar sewn. We have prepared it for ease, and if you look at it, you're going to look at it and go, well, this is all bunchy, it's bubbly. Yes, it is. Your collar is never going to lay flat. It's going to curl and it's going to be around a neck, and so it's not supposed to lay flat. We're trying to get it so that it is smooth in its final position. We've now favored it so it'll go around. We've got to finish the favor so that it can come up out of the collar band and roll down. In order to do that, we need to take out the basting, this last bit of basting here that was attaching our interfacing to the collar. And so we're going to pull that basting out because the 3 pieces of fabric need to be able to slide independently of each other. Because it's basting, it will pull out fairly quickly. And because, remember, when you basted this, you went from center back towards the style edge, it's clipped in the center anyhow, and so it doesn't have to pull very far to get across that. And so you can pull it out, get it unpicked. Okay. What has to happen here is the collar is going to be sewn in a collar band that's around the shirt, and so it has to fold that direction. Okay? If you remember from the cuff, it will tend to bubble unless we favor that edge. So if you will lay your collar, so the collar side is down. Mine's easy to tell because my collar side is orange, my under collar is green. Lay the collar side down. Just take a ruler, and if you'll just take a ruler and kind of ease it over towards the edge, and I'm just going to take my seam allowance of my fabric and fold it back over the ruler. If I take that seam allowance of the fabric, fold it back over the ruler, and then pin it in place there as it is folded. If you look at that, you can see that it's beveled that edge. I'm getting the under collar coming out. You can see that some of the interfacing is starting to show. It takes those 3 layers and allows them to slip around each other much in the same fashion and lay smooth against each other as if they were coming out of a collar band. Be careful at the tip not to flatten your collar again. Let that tip still tend to curl like it wants to. Got that edge pinned in place. Okay. So when that's pinned, you can see that it did slightly bevel or slightly change those edges so they don't necessarily line up to each other. Now if you lay this flat, if you were to lay this flat, you can see my collar is bubbled. Yes, it is. It's not going to lay flat though. It's always going to be coming out of a collar band, and so it's allowing it to lay flat and be smooth when it's curled. So when that's curled and when that's in place now, we want to get that steamed in place. So you'll take a ham, stay. This is easiest to do if you will have your collar kind of do its best Elvis imitation and put it upwards on the ham. And just find part of the ham so that the ham is as big around as the collar is, and the ham is becoming the neck now. And if you will take pins and just stab into the ham at 5/8 of an inch, stabbing it all the way around. Okay. Then you can take your collar. That came out. And just turn it down against those pins that are at 5/8 of an inch. Okay. That gives you another chance to look at and see, are my collars the same length? Does it line up? Reach up underneath and see, does the collar lay smooth? Is it bubbled at all? If it lays the way that you want it to, you are now going to take your iron and just shoot steam at it. Don't actually press that curve, just shoot steam. And you will steam it all the way around and then let it sit on the ham until it cools off, and that will help to train the collar that it's supposed to turn that direction. And so you'll steam it all the way around, then you will let it sit on the ham. All right, after it's cooled, when it's sat on the ham, you can simply pull your collar off. The pins that were stabbed into the ham will just pull right back out again. You are now going to remove the pins that were stabbed into the ham. Leave the pins in that we put in place, pinning it over the top of the ruler. Just take out the pins that were stabbing it into the ham. You will see that it tends to want to curl, it tends to want to stay bowed around. It tends to want to be shaped the way the collar was shaped. The very last step that we're going to do is now base this in place so that when we attach the collar to the collar band, we are not tempted to pull that edge back out again and align it. We want to space that in place so that beveled edge stays beveled as we attach it to the collar. So we're going to come to the sewing machine. You're going to start at center back. And because we've had this on a ham and it has been trained, you can actually see it wants to stay curled up. If you can see the tip, I don't know if you can you see the tip? If you see the tip of this collar, it is tending to roll and to curl. That's exactly what we want to have happen. So we are just going to simply baste this edge and keep it curled up against the edge. I'm keeping that beveled favor in by basting this with the collar held up at the angle that it's going to be coming out of the collar band when the time comes. So you baste it from center back to the front. As you do the other side, the collar is going to have to be in up underneath the arm of the sewing machine. Okay, but that same idea. You just baste it holding the edge up there. And again, as that tip comes towards the edge, you can see the tip is tending to curl and to roll. That's exactly what we want to have happen. Now that it is basted, you can see that all that the basting does is hold that bevel in place. So that little bubble that was there is held in place. But when the collar is in a shirt, it's going to be turned, and notice that that lays completely smooth. There is no bubble. If you look at the inside lays smooth. There's not a ripple, there's not a bubble, there's not a pull. It makes it so the collar lays smooth inside and out. When you're done, your collar will sit at an angle like that. Just put your stuff in your tote tray, put your collar in there, put this on the top so that it doesn't get smashed, and then we will attach your collar to your collar band and attach that to your shirt the next time. That is your collar.